morning. How's everybody doing today? It's good to see everybody out there in the audience. Looks like we've got Jade, Deerica, Sarah King. Good to see you, Imani. How's everybody doing today? Now, you know this is week 8, so our second midterm is this weekend. It's going to cover chapters 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. So that's going to be sensation and perception. Then it's going to be behaviorism, cognitive psychology, and intelligence testing that we're going to be talking about this week. The exam is going to have the typical format that it had last time, multiple choice, short answer, matching questions, and there will be a review session Friday morning at 9 a.m. Hope everybody's going to be here for the review session, right? If you can't make it, of course, you can watch it recorded, but hopefully you'll be here Friday morning at 9 a.m. So don't forget, for those of you just showing up, it is exam week. Exam week. The exam is going to become available on Friday morning, and it will be due Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. I see we have other people trickling into the room. Good morning, Andrea. Good morning, Melody. Good morning, Rasha. It's good to see everybody in the class. Looks like we've got a pretty good audience today. Thanks for coming. Let's see, so that's the exam week. Don't forget, we have a webinar tonight at 8 p.m. Hopefully you can make it. We're going to be doing some problem solving and talking about IQ tests today, so hopefully you can come in and do that. You can come and join me for the webinar tonight at 8 o'clock. Just a quick note, I'm going to put this in the announcements. Next week's Tuesday night webinar. Next week, not this week, but next week, the 9th of March, that webinar on Tuesday night is going to be moved to Wednesday night. So just giving you a heads up for those of you who are here this morning who like to come to the Tuesday night lectures. Tonight we're meeting at 8 p.m., but next week we're going to move the webinar over one day. Okay, everybody got that? So I do look forward to seeing everybody. You've done a great job so far this semester. I want to tell you, I've been looking at the discussion boards and reading your comments very closely. I typically try to stay out of the discussion boards and let the students do the talking. But what I've noticed is that a lot of people have been putting more than the required 3 posts. Some people have been doing 4 or 5 and 6 replies. And I noticed that there seems to be a little interactivity and real engagement on the discussion boards. And I just want to thank everybody for being great students so far. All right. So, yes, it will be next Wednesday night at 8 p.m. But this week we're doing 8 p.m. tonight. And then next week we will switch up the webinar. I'm going to be traveling, so I won't be able to get to webinar on Tuesday night. So we'll have to move it to Wednesday night. Does that sound okay? Everybody doing all right? Tell me something good. What's happening in your life? Who's got something interesting to share? Go ahead and type it in the chat bar, and I'm going to go ahead and queue up the lecture. If anybody's got anything interesting to say. Well, it looks like we've got 8 people in the house right now. Thanks. Always a great crowd. I really am impressed by those of you that come to the live lectures in the mornings. I really, really appreciate your responsibility and your engagement. Holy cow, Deerica has a birthday tomorrow. Nice. Here we go, folks. Everybody with me, if we could. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Deerica. Happy birthday to you. You get an exam. All right. So, thank you. I hope everybody was singing happy birthday with me to Deerica. It's good to see that. Fantastic. When you get my age, birthdays aren't a celebration anymore. You're just sort of depressed when you look at the number. But I'm glad you're having a happy birthday tomorrow, dear, and I hope you get everything you want. So let's go ahead and get started. Sorry, I was messing with the PowerPoint presentation and went through here. Okay. So what we're going to do today, real quick, we're going to talk a little bit about the invention of IQ tests. We're going to talk about the properties of IQ tests. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, we're going to talk about how we can evaluate the quality of IQ tests and newer theories of intelligence. So who's going to be interested in IQ tests? You're going to see IQ tests used in lots of applied settings. Remember we talked about applied psychology versus basic research? IQ tests are an instrument, a tool, if you will, that are used in a lot of applied settings. Where are you going to find them? Well, you're going to find them in schools. They are used an awful lot in schools to stratify and classify students and to see where these students need to be sent for their education. They're going to be used when students are struggling in school to help understand the nature of these students' problems. They're going to be used in court settings as well, in forensic psychology, to look at whether or not people have the capability to take care of themselves in terms of estate decisions or in terms of psychiatric type decisions that the court may make. IQ tests are used in determining culpability. It's illegal here in the United States to to assign the death penalty to anybody who has an intellectual deficiency. How do you determine if someone has an intellectual deficiency? Well, in part, you use an IQ test. So you're going to see IQ tests used in courts as well as in schools. And check this out. Businesses also use IQ tests. Did you know that the NFL uses a very short IQ test and gives that test to all of the people it's thinking about drafting every year? Football players take IQ tests before joining the NFL. Did you know that there was a police department up in Maine that actually turned down a candidate because his IQ was too high? So businesses also use IQ tests. You know what? The military uses IQ tests. Everybody uses IQ tests. So we're going to talk a little bit about today where IQ tests come from and what they measure. Okay, fantastic. So first thing I want to tell you is an IQ test is going to be different from any other test you take during your stay here at Wake Tech. So the test that I'm giving you this Friday is what's known as a test of achievement. Did you learn Chapter 5, Chapter 6, Chapter 7, and Chapter 8? Did you achieve this material? Okay. Now, does this mean you're smart or dumb? Absolutely not. All it says is, did Dearica prepare for my test by studying these 4 chapters? Knowing these 4 chapters doesn't mean you're a smart person. Not knowing these chapters does not mean you're not a genius. What it means is you just did not study the material. Okay. So achievement tests evaluate how you learn a set of information. Okay. On the other hand, what IQ tests attempt to measure is this thing called aptitude. Now, if you think about it, everything you learn, some people learn quicker than other people. I don't know if you ever met one of those people that just seems to pick things up quick. Are you one of those people that seems to pick things up quick? Aptitude is your ability to learn, how well I could put some information in your brain. And so IQ tests are what we call aptitude tests. They are one form of an aptitude test that we can take. So what I want you to know is the difference between an achievement test and an aptitude test. And I want you to know that IQ tests are interested in evaluating your ability to learn, not necessarily what you do know or what your culture says you should know, but how clever a person you are. Now, the first IQ tests were invented by a fellow named Alfred Binet. He was actually a French lawyer invited by the government to help develop a test to help identify students who might need extra help in school. So if you ever had those students, maybe in school when you were in second, third, fourth, fifth grade, those kids that maybe had a little bit of trouble, maybe they had a learning disorder, maybe they had a math or a reading disorder, maybe they just had trouble picking things up as quickly as you. Uh, the French government was interested in providing extra support to these kinds of students, but they didn't have any way of figuring out who these students were. So they asked Alfred Binet to invent a test, not to measure intelligence, but just to figure out which kids were going to need extra support in school. And he developed a test that included about 40 tasks that they could be given in a one-on-one situation. And he believed that your ability on these tests could help determine how old and how developed your mind was. Have you, or 30 questions, excuse me. Have you ever heard of reading on grade level? Have you ever heard that before, or being on grade level? Think about it. That's exactly what these first IQ tests were. He had these different test questions. Some of these questions were super easy, or some of these tasks were super easy. He would light a match and then move it back and forth in front of your eyes. And any kid over the age of 1 will follow a lighted match with their eyes. He had a slightly different task. When the child would come into the room, he would hold his hands out. When somebody holds their hand out to you, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to shake that hand. And he found that the older kids, the 3 and 4-year-olds, had figured that out. And then he had this final difficult question. My neighbors had 3 visitors this week. My neighbors had a doctor, a lawyer, and a priest visit his house. What is happening to my neighbor? And he figured out that only the oldest kids could figure out that the neighbor must be dying. And so what he did was he had these 30 tasks, and he could sort of, based on the pattern of questions that you got right and wrong, he thought he could guess how old your mind was or your mental ability. He would then compare that to your chronological age to see if you were ahead of grade level or ahead of your age or behind your age. So if you were a 4-year-old child and you could do it, and so let's see, go to the whiteboard. Uh-oh, sorry, I got my thing crooked. If you were 4 years old and you had 4 years old mental age, okay, and let's say chronological age, okay, then you were 1. On the other hand, if your mental age was 4, and your chronological age was 6, I wrote this upside down here, and your mental age was 6, he would say you were at 0.67. You were behind, right? On the other hand, if your mental age was 6, Okay. Hello, I'm back. Jeez, that was terrible. Have you got me now? Can you see me? I don't know what happened. My front camera just died. I have no idea what happened. I apologize for that. Okay. I am so sorry. Please forgive me for the technical problem. My front camera just died on me. Okay, so Alfred Binet calculated this IQ test where he could compare your mental age to your chronological age to see if you were ahead or behind. Now, what he did was he figured out how old the average mental age was by looking at French school children. Do you remember when we talked about milestones a couple of weeks ago, and we said that we have to figure out what the average child could do? In a sense, this is what he did. He figured what the average French school child could know. Now, a fellow across the pond in the United States, in California, named William Stern at Stanford University, renormed this test. He went back and figured out what the average 2-year-old American child can do, what the average 3-year-old American child could do, what the average 4-year-old American child could do. And so he renormed the test. Remember, I used these terms, norms, when we talked about milestones for children. He renormed the test and began multiplying the fraction by $100 to remove the by 100 points to remove the decimal point. All right. So, do you folks? I'm going to try this. No, I'm afraid to try it. I was going to go to my screen, but it might freeze up again. But in a sense, if you take a kid whose mental age is 4 and his chronological age is 4, his ratio is 1, multiply that times 100 and you get 100. And so this guy, William Stern, renormed the test for American children and began multiplying the fraction by 100 to remove the decimal point. And the Stanford revision of the Binet-Simon IQ test was born. And the Stanford Binet test is the oldest IQ test that is still in use today. It was its first use was in World War I, classifying U.S. soldier recruits. It was called the Army Alpha Test. Anybody ever taken the ASVAB test? Have any of you ever taken the ASVAB test? If you have, please type in the chat bar. The ASVAB test is an IQ test designed to be useful in military settings. So it's an IQ test. So there are lots of forms of the IQ test. And the first widespread use of IQ testing in America or in the world was used during World War I by the United States military, called the ASVAB test. All right. Now, this test became so popular. You help your boyfriend study for an IQ test. Okay, interesting. Now, this test was so stinking popular that it became sort of something that everyone wanted to use. And so a new test was developed which moved away from this idea of comparing mental age to chronological age, because mental age and chronological age is great in developmental settings, but it's not good for adults. So you can tell me that Billy is 4 and he has the mind of a 6-year-old. That means something to me. But if you say Ted is a 30-year-old and he has the mind of a 35-year-old, that doesn't make any sense to me. So we have to change it around, and we're going to talk about how we do that in just a second, okay? Actually, let's do it now. So comparing chronological age and mental age to determine an IQ is flawed because it doesn't work for adults. Now, this first test that was used in the military, the Army Alpha test that was used in World War I, which was based on the Stanford Binet test, was such a popular IQ test that people said, hey, we need to use this test everywhere. But the Army Alpha test was flawed because it compared mental age to chronological age, which doesn't make sense for adults. So these newer tests that were evaluated were created based upon this thing called the deviation method. So here's what we're going to do. Instead of trying to figure out how old your mind is, these newer IQ tests said, let's compare all the people of the same age and let's rank them from the person who does best on the test to the person who does the most the poorest on the test. All right. So if you look at this chart underneath me, this is what we call a frequency distribution, which tells you all of the different test scores that people might have had. So let's say we have a test with 200 questions. I can rank you from the person who gets the most questions right to the person who gets the fewest questions right. Okay? And so that's what modern IQ tests do. And then the person in the middle, the median person, is going to be considered average. And so what they do is they re-norm test and they use what are called standardized test scores. So whoever scores in the 50th percentile is given the arbitrary number of 100. And if you score better than that median person, your IQ is higher than 100. And if you score more poorly than that person, your IQ is below 100. Now, one of the crazy things that you're going to see about test performance on IQ tests or performance on IQ tests is that performance on IQ tests and the number of questions that people get right tends to follow what we call a normal distribution. Most people score somewhere in the middle near that median person, and only a few people get all the questions right, and only a few people miss all the questions. So, people who developed modern IQ tests found that you could rank people and compare people to their same age group. So, the 100 down here doesn't mean your mental age and chronological age are the same. What it means is for all people who are 20 or 30 or 50 or however old you are that you're being compared to, of all those people, if you score 100, that means you scored the median. You were the median in terms of number of questions answered right. And so now modern IQ tests use what's known as the deviation method, right? So here's the deal. We're still trying to figure out how quick you are in your mind, how sharp you are. And so we give you this test and we compare you to the people who are the same age to see how you compare to people who are just like you. All right? Now, 100 is still the mean, but 100 is an arbitrary number. And you know what? Every 5 or 10 years, they have to re-norm the test and find out what 100 is. And did you know what? It turns out that every generation scores better on an IQ test than the previous generation. So in order to be considered average today, you have to be far more clever than you were in 1950. If you were considered above average on a 1930 IQ test, you would probably be considered below average on a modern IQ test because people seem to be getting more clever or better at these tests. All right. Now, you'll notice that 68% of the people fall somewhere in the middle of this distribution. We're going to call the middle 68% of this distribution, we're going to call these people, I hate to use this word, but we're going to use the word average. All right? That's where the average, the middle grouping of people are. If you score between 115 and 130, you know what we're going to call you? We're going to say that your IQ score is above average, above average. If your IQ score falls between 85 and 70, we're going to say that your IQ score is below average, below average. Now, do you look at the people up there in the 130 range? Okay, actually, it turns out that the cutoff line is really more about 125 than 130. If any of you have ever been in an academically gifted program in middle or elementary school, if you have a child that was is in a gifted program? Does anyone in here have a child or who has ever been involved in an academically gifted program in elementary or middle school? Anybody? Anybody? If you have, it's because you took an IQ test and you scored over 125. Okay, there you go, Melody. Okay, what that means is when you took that IQ test, you scored better than 95% of the population. Your IQ was somewhere up there in the mid 120s. So that meant you were the top of the distribution. Well, that's the thing. You'd have to been a little bit sharper. Yes, Andrea, that's a good point because kids are getting smarter uh, every different generation. So if you're about 125 to 130, we're going to use this word gifted. Now, don't get a big head because just because you do well on an IQ test does not mean you're a knucklehead. It just means that you kick butt on the stuff that is good for school. I was academically gifted too, so I'm not going to put too much stock in it, right? Now, if you score below 70, okay, you may be diagnosed as having an intellectual disability. They used to use a phrase called mental retardation. We don't use that anymore. We instead say that you have an intellectual disability. But look at the last sentence on my chart, and this is actually on the homework and on the exam. Diagnosis of intellectual disability is not automatic. Not only do you have to score below 70 on an IQ test, but you also have to show impairment in performing daily activities. I have a friend right now whose IQ, if he took an IQ test, his IQ would be below 70. And this is because my friend is so dyslexic that he has difficulty reading and responding to any form of a written test. However, my friend, and I'm not going to give you his name because you may know him, he's a local guy around here. This guy is a genius auto mechanic. He is a genius auto mechanic that probably makes, we don't talk about money, but I'll bet he makes more than me fixing cars. If you tested his IQ, though, he would show up in that below 70 range because he has trouble reading. But he has absolutely no impaired ability to perform. He makes a ton of money. He just doesn't do well on IQ tests. However, in court settings, in school settings, if you score below 70, the psychologist will evaluate your totality of functioning. And if you also show impaired functioning in your day-to-day abilities, you may get a diagnosis of intellectual disability. All right, so here's what I want you to know with IQ tests. They were invented about 110 years ago by a fellow who was asked to help identify who was going to do well in school and which children were going to need extra support in school. This guy, Alfred Binet, created what he called an IQ test, or created a test. It wasn't called IQ when he created it. And what he did was he compared your mental age to your chronological age to see if you were progressing as fast as you should, just like the milestones that we talked about in chapter 4. This test, though it was created in France, became popular in the United States after William Stern renormed and renamed this test, and after it was used in World War I very effectively by the United States military. However, newer tests have instead, they still measure this thing we call IQ, but what they do is they compare your intellectual school-related abilities to people of your similar age to see where you fall in this distribution, this normal distribution. Now, where are you going to see modern IQ tests? You know what? You're going to see them in your schools, courts, clinical settings, and business settings, as I mentioned at the beginning of class. So your schools, The person that's going to use this is going to be a school psychologist. Remember, school psychologists are different from educational psychologists. An educational psychologist is a basic researcher that designs teaching methodologies based on research. A school psychologist is that person that's down in the main office who helps you if you're struggling in school. Now, your school psychologist is going to use them. They're going to use them in two settings. They're going to give pencil and paper tests in elementary school. All of you who were in AG, all of us who were in AG, actually all of you took an IQ test probably in third grade, second grade, or third grade, and it was called the Woodcock-Johnson test. It was a pencil and paper test. And you know what? It is the most popular pencil and paper test out there in the world right now. Now, it's used to basically classify children we call normal and gifted. It's the test we use to find gifted children. However, if you're struggling in school, if you're failing third grade, if you're failing second grade, if you're failing in fourth grade, and there's no apparent reason, you're not having behavioral problems, you're not having problems at home, you will go into the psychologist's office, and what they will do is they will do an evaluation of you. Now, this is a multi-point evaluation, but one of the things that they will do is they will give you an IQ test. And this IQ test is used to help identify children with special needs. Do you have a learning disorder? Do you have ADD? Do you have math disorder? Do you have an intellectual disability? What's wrong? Why are you not succeeding in school? Now, one quick note, you'll notice over here it says individually administered tests to help identify children with special needs. IQ tests are used in two broad settings: to classify large groups of people and to identify people with problems. Whenever you're classifying a large group of people, like military recruits or like second grade school children, you can use a pencil and paper test. But in clinical settings where they're trying to diagnose a problem, you will get the test as it was done by Alfred Binet 110 years ago. It is done in an individual setting. Why is it done in an individual setting? Well, in a one-on-one setting, the psychologist can evaluate things like whether or not you have trouble hearing, whether or not your vision is impairing your ability to respond to the test. The administrator of the test can see if there are language and communication problems. All of these things can slip by a paper and pencil test. However, an individual one-on-one test allows the psychologist to evaluate other functioning abilities that might affect your test score. So you're going to see IQ tests used a lot in school sections to classify students and also to help identify learning disorders. You know what? You're going to see IQ tests in court settings. Forensic psychologists are going to use them. So that's another subfield of psychology. Psychologists who work in court settings are often called forensic psychologists. Now, why would we use them? Well, we might use them in terms of individual responsibility or capability. As I suggested to you, it is considered unconstitutional, against the law, to give capital punishment to execute people who have intellectual disabilities. So, whenever you are up for the death penalty, one of the things that might be used if you're close to the borderline is an IQ test to determine whether or not you are culpable and capable of being executed. Now, at this point, we're talking about points too. If you have 75 on the IQ test, I'm sorry, you do not have an intellectual disability. If your IQ is 68 and you show impaired functioning, you may escape the death penalty. So we use them in court settings where these numbers are really, really important. Now, clinical psychologists will also use them too. If you're having a psychiatric problem, if your child is having a problem and you send your child to a child psychologist, they will almost certainly receive an IQ test as a part of their evaluation process. Just like when you go into your medical doctor, they take your blood pressure, your temperature, and weigh your height and weight, and do all these basic measures. If you send your child in for a clinical evaluation, one of the things they'll probably evaluate is your child's IQ. Okay. Now, and they are used in conjunction with other tools for the diagnosis of psychological problems. So not only will your kid take an IQ test, but they'll probably take anxiety scales. They'll probably take personality tests. They'll probably take depression inventories. They'll take a bunch of tests. But one of the things that your child will get is an IQ test. Now, in clinical settings, probably the most popular clinical IQ test, there are lots of different IQ tests. I mentioned to you the Stanford Binet. That's the oldest IQ test that's still in use today. The Woodcock-Johnson over here is the most popular pencil and paper test, but the most popular individual one-on-one test that's used in clinical settings is what's known as the Wechsler tests. And this guy, David Wechsler, made 3 different forms of his IQ tests. One for children uh, uh, earlier than school age, for children 4 to 6 years old. Then an IQ test for children who are in primary and the K through 12 school. And then he has a third IQ test for adult intelligence for adults 16 and older. And so we have the WIPSI, the WISC, and the WACE. If you were my age and you had to take an IQ test, actually all of us, probably all of you, or at least 16, we would all take the WACE, okay? If you had a 12-year-old child, if you sent your 9-year-old child to the clinical psychologist, they would probably take the WISC, which is the Wechsler scale for children. And did you know we can begin to reliably measure IQ at the age of 4? Starting at the age of 4, IQ, whatever it is, can be reliably measured. And they have an IQ test for that age group. The WIPSI is an IQ test for children in the 4 to 5-year-old age. So the Wechsler scales, the most popular individually administered test. And I want you to know this for your test. The Wechsler scales, they have 3 different Wechsler scales based upon how old you are. Now, you're also going to see IQ tests in business settings as well. And they're usually used to classify new employees or screen potential employees for fit. These tests, typically, it's very expensive to give an individual test. And in a business setting, you're giving hundreds of tests. So they do pencil and paper tests. There are 2 good examples of these. The ASVAB is an IQ test that's used in the military business setting, and it's used for military recruits. And the Wonderlic test is used in business settings and most famously used in the NFL. And every year, there's always a news story about some quarterback that scored really low on the Wonderlic IQ test, or some lineman or other person you wouldn't think to be that clever, some big oafy guy that scores really high on the Wonderlic IQ tests. And the Wonderlic test, the thing with the Woodcock-Johnson and the ASVAB is these tests are super duper long and take an hour, maybe even an hour and a half test to take. The cool thing about the Wonderlic is it's a 45 item IQ test. It's or less than 50 items, and it can be taken relatively quickly. And in these settings, they actually are just trying to find out quickly how to classify you in terms of your suitability for the job. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, there was a court case several years ago where a police department up in New Hampshire or Maine, I forget exactly where it was, gave out IQ tests as a part of its hiring process, and it actually turned a candidate down because he scored too high on the IQ test. And their past history had shown that people with IQs too high tended to find police work kind of boring. And the police department had to spend a lot of money to train you, and they didn't want to train somebody who was going to quit. This guy sued the police department and took it to court, and guess what? He actually lost his case. And the police department was allowed to not hire him because he scored too high on an IQ test. I actually find that incredibly hilarious. I have a brother who is a police officer, so I always like to tease him about some people being too smart to be police officers. I love him and I love the police, but being my brother, I always have to give him as much crap as I can. So every time I see him, I remind him that he is not too smart to be in the police, right? And so I make sure that my brother knows that every time we talk. What has prevented testing under the age of 4? I'm sorry, I just noticed your question, Ashley. Um, Probably verbal and communication problems, Ashley. IQ tests are typically used to measure reasoning related to school and scientific activities. And so it's probably more of a communication question than anything else. That's a great question, Ashley. Now, here's the thing. One of the things, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you, when they measure cognitive milestones, and socio-emotional milestones in infant development, you're hitting milestones as a 2-year-old and 3-year-old does not predict your adult intelligence. Milestones, as they are measured in infancy, and intelligence, as it is measured starting in 4, are two completely different things. And just because your child's cognitive milestones are a little bit behind at age 1 does not mean that they are going to score poorly on an IQ test. That's a great question for 2-year-olds. I would love to know where my son is. That's funny, Ashley. You know what? Wait 2 years and you'll be able to find out. Now, you might say, holy cow, how come we have to wait till 4? Check this out. Did you know that personality cannot be reliably measured until 18 years of age? Your personality fluctuates, and your personality at 12 doesn't necessarily predict your personality at 22, 32, or 42. Personality can't reliably be measured until your late teens, but you can reliably measure IQ at the age of 4. IQ is the first human measurement that can begin to be reliably measured at the age of 4. And your IQ at age 4 is going to predict your IQ at the age 14, at the age 24, and at the age of 54. So if you're above average as a 4-year-old, you're probably going to be above average as a 54-year-old or a 74-year-old. So it's kind of amazing. You might say, why can't we measure IQ earlier? I would say it's amazing that we can measure it as early as we actually do. Right? Great question, though, Nicole. Great question. Okay, now let's see. Quick thing to think of. One thing I do want to point out to you. A lot of people talk about your full scale IQ. My IQ is a 110. My IQ is a 130. We often, I don't know, legend is that Einstein's IQ was 195. When people throw those numbers around, they're talking about the general IQ score, your full scale IQ score, or what we sometimes refer to as G, your general intellectual ability. And G is very useful when you're comparing a lot of people. If we have 30 million school children every year to compare, we need to compare them on one number. And that's what is done in making decisions like that in school. We have this big number, and it's called G. However, we know that that IQ is actually composed of different things. Typically, and back in the early days of IQ, the theorists would argue, should we have just one number to represent your IQ, or should we have multiple numbers? Some people argued that we should think of IQ as one number. These people were behind what we call G theory, okay? IQ is one thing. The other people said, no, no, no. If you really want to understand somebody's intellectual ability, you have to think of it as a bunch of specific abilities, right? And these people followed what we might call S theory. And the people argued, is intelligence one thing or is it multiple things? Well, now we know that you can really think of intelligence as both of those, all right? We all have this thing called G, and our intellectual abilities all feed into this, but we also have differential abilities. How many of you are really good at English and history, but really struggle with math? Is anybody like that? I don't struggle with math, but I'm gifted verbally, and I'm only above average in math, right? But I am way better at English than I am at math. Do we have anybody that's the opposite, that you're super good at math, but you're not very good at history and writing papers in English? Does anybody have that difference? Me. Okay. Yeah. I'll get to that. Great question. Just a second, Imani. Great question. Okay. If you've ever had that experience, then you understand that you shouldn't think about IQ as one thing. In fact, a major way to break it up is in terms of your verbal IQ and your nonverbal performance, or what we might call your logic math IQ. And so, if you took the IQ test in third grade, you might have been sent to the academically gifted reading classes, or you might have been sent to the academically gifted math classes, or you might have been sent to both of those, right? So we know that we have a verbal intellectual ability and a logical IQ ability. And so modern IQ tests, when you get your test scores, you're going to get not only one number called your full scale IQ, but it's going to be broken down and you're going to see your verbal IQ and your performance IQ, right? And you know what? If you look further, you could even break those verbal and those performance down into specific abilities. So for your verbal IQ, your vocabulary, the size of your vocabulary feeds into your verbal IQ. Your ability to understand the similarities and differences between things feeds into your verbal IQ. Your knowledge of information is part of your verbal IQ. Did you know that your knowledge of simple arithmetic is actually a verbal ability? When I ask you what 4 plus 3 is, you're not doing math. You're actually going to your rote memory. 4 plus 3 is 7. That's not math. That's actually English. And that and your digit span. Remember last week when I talked about the size of your short-term memory, your digit span. All of these things fit into what we would call your verbal ability. And then on the other side, your ability to complete a picture, your ability to guess what's coming next in a series of pictures, your ability to put together a puzzle in the form of a block or a picture or block design, your ability to do symbol searching and to reason mathematically. These all figure into your performance or your nonverbal IQ. Now, why do we need this? In a clinical setting, it's not as useful just to have one number. I need to be able to look at all of your individual abilities in order to figure out not only whether or not your school ability is not going well, but what exactly is the root cause of this problem. And so now modern IQ tests, and actually I'm going to go ahead and show you this real quick. Modern IQ tests, does everybody see the screen right here? This is actually sort of a version right here. Okay, do you see this? You'll notice this is actually a report from an IQ test. And this person's full scale IQ is a 62. All right. So their full scale IQ is below 70. So this person might have an intellectual deficiency. Now let's figure out the nature of this intellectual deficiency. Notice that it now is broken down into two categories, a nonverbal IQ and a verbal IQ. Notice their mathematical and nonverbal reasoning is a 72, which is below average but not intellectually deficient. But notice that their verbal IQ is way below 70. And so this person is definitely, if you wanted to know the nature of their intellectual deficiency, we would say it's more language than it is mathematical. Do you see that? Does that make sense? Now, I could go down one more level and look at their very specific skills here. Now, this is the Stanford Binet. The other categories that I was showing you on the PowerPoint have slightly different categories, but look at this knowledge right here. You've got nonverbal scores and verbal scores. And you see you have 5 verbal scores and you have 5 nonverbal scores. And so what they're showing you is where your percentiles are. And what you're going to see is that this kid's nonverbal skills, their visual spatial memory and their working memory, their ability to do mathematical related stuff is bad. It's in the 37th percentile, but it's not as bad as everything. Look at their verbal scores. All of them are less than the 10th percentile. Their knowledge, their visual spatial memory, their working memory, these are all less than 1 percentile. They're way at the end of that bell curve, that normal distribution. And if you'll see, their nonverbal scores aren't quite that low, right? And so what I want you to see is that by looking at these pattern of scores, we can sort of figure out what the nature of your intellectual problem is. So I want you to understand the difference between what we call G, your overall intellectual ability, IQ ability, which is represented by the full scale IQ, but we can break that down into S's, which are more important in clinical settings when we're trying to diagnose people's intellectual ability. Does that make sense? All right, so Imani asked one last question before I go. Imani asked a question. We were talking about something happening to the mind around 70 years old in the previous chapter. Yes, and it actually can be represented by this picture. If you'll look, one of the ways that we think about intelligence is in terms of fluid and non-fluid reasoning. Do you see down here in the bottom scores where it says nonverbal and verbal scores, do you see how we have fluid reasoning and knowledge? Fluid reasoning and knowledge. Fluid reasoning is how flexible your thinking is, how creative your thinking is, how good your thinking is in sort of open-ended, non-standard problems. That's the kind of intelligence that begins going down as you get older, Imani. Your knowledge of your mathematical times tables is not going to decrease. Your knowledge of what a bird is, what a hawk is, what an eagle is, those kinds of what we call crystallized knowledge is not going to decrease as you get older. But the part of your IQ abilities that begin to tank as you get older is your fluid reasoning abilities. Does that make sense, Imani? Cossette, I can tell you right off the bat, you are not dumb by any stretch of the imagination. Here's the deal. All of you are sitting in this college class. That means all of you have passed high school. All of you are at least above or at least average and above. And I would say probably almost all of you, if you took an IQ test, would score in the 110 to 115 range at least. And Cossette, I've seen your work over the course of the semester. I'd be willing to bet money that you're going to score in the 115 range at least. At least. Cossette asks a great question. Does IQ testing show someone's complete knowledge? That, my friend, is going to be the focus of webinar tonight. and the focus of the lecture on Thursday. I'm going to argue to you that your IQ test is not a complete measure of your intellectual abilities as a person. That's a great question. That is a great question, and I'm going to go ahead and leave that there because that's what we're going to talk about next week. And you know what? Before we finish, I ran out of time and I didn't talk about this. I'll talk about this to start Thursday's lecture. Okay, we are at the end of our time together. I'm sorry I spent too much time. Did you learn anything today? Do you feel like you learned anything about IQ testing, or was this all a confusing blur? Uh, um, so I just want you to know that IQ tests, they were created to help identify poor performing school children. They became so popular that they are a way of measuring human capability for good or for bad. And we're going to talk about it on Tuesday and Thursday. And they are used in clinical settings, business settings, and school settings to help us classify, organize, and identify people who may or may not need help. Okay. Oh boy, Cosette. And Cosette's asking all these awesome questions, these very good philosophical questions. You know what, Cosette, maybe you should be an IQ researcher because the questions you're asking are the exact questions asked by Howard Gardner, Robert Stern, Cattell, and a ton of other people that came up with alternate ways of thinking about intelligence. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Hey, look, folks, I'm going to go ahead and log off now. Please come to webinar tonight and we'll talk about what you think intelligence is, okay? Take care and have a great day. Bye.